Welcome back, everyone. Without further ado, let me introduce the next speaker, Stuart Mcginnis. Stuart was educated at Oxford University and Queen's University Belfast and is the IUCN Global Director for Nature-Based Solutions. He has worked in sustainable development and biodiversity conservation for 35 years, 15 of which were based in Tanzania, Sudan, Ghana, and Costa Rica. He led the development and promotion of forest landscape restoration as a nature-based solution, to which over 60 countries have committed 118 million hectares under the Bond Challenge. He and his team at IUCN have worked over the last 12 years on defining and promoting the concept of nature-based solutions and supporting its application to climate change, food and water security, and disaster risk reduction. And they have just finalized a 2-year process to develop a much-needed global standard. It is wonderful that you were able to join us here today. Stuart, thank you, and to set the scene for today's talks. Over to you, Stuart. Please share your screen.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. We can see your slides as well. That's great.
Okay, fantastic. And you can see the slides.
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie, and good afternoon, colleagues. It's really with great pleasure that I join you to open sessions 3 and 4 with a focus on people and biodiversity. And I'd really like to give acknowledgement and thanks to Natalie and Oxford University's Nature-Based Solutions Initiative for organising these digital dialogues. As an introduction to this afternoon session, I would like to give a quick outline of the work we in IUCN have been doing to develop a nature-based solutions standard as an operational framework that draws on almost 2 decades of piloting, learning and practice. So I'm going to begin with really stressing the importance of precision and clarity in our understanding of what nature-based solutions entail and what they're intended to deliver. This may seem a bit of an anodyne statement, and yet leaving NbS open to a generous interpretation of what it is does actually limit its potential, and could and often does generate doubt over how it could impact both people and nature, the 2 key topics that we are considering today. As Natalie highlighted yesterday, the term nature-based solutions was referenced in a World Bank publication in 2006, and IUCN started to promote it as an umbrella term 2 years later. But its antecedents, as well as the pitfalls of imprecision, go back much further than that. In the 1980s and 1990s, some of you may be old enough to remember the integrated conservation and development projects, which aspired to do many of the things that nature-based solutions now lay claim to, but fell out of favour after legitimate critiques by colleagues such as Michael Wells and Tom McShane and others, in that ICDPs suffered from being neither fish nor fowl, and there was no real evidence of either effectively delivering against conservation objectives or development objectives. And indeed, in January 2017, an editorial in Nature recognized exactly the same challenge, that we really do need to have clarity of what we mean so that we can actually really do some good. And it was in this light, actually, and maybe in anticipation of the Nature editorial, that IUCN a couple of months earlier had actually identified and worked through a process with its members to put in place a definition that we now use quite regularly. So the first point is really sort of that precision underpins progress. The immediate intention of establishing the definition was to make clear that NbS solutions were rooted in functioning ecosystems. Be they natural or modified, intact or under restoration. And prior to that, the term nature-based solutions was regularly co-opted to include other technologies such as renewables, biomimicry, and while these are worthy and deserve our support, they only derive or they are inspired by nature, but they do not actually require ongoing input from nature. So there are other implications about a more precise understanding of nature-based solutions, because while it shares a common foundation with conservation, with more conventional approaches to conservation, and it's got this common foundation of conservation science and norms, its ultimate objective is different. It's to efficiently and effectively deliver key societal needs and safeguard society. Distinguishing the end purposes draws strongly on how this almost forgotten critique of ICDPs highlighted the risks of conflating different goals and coming down to sort of more general win-win platitudes. And I think one of the real values in really distinguishing what are nature-based solutions and how they are distinct from other conservation approaches is that it highlights that, first of all, not all conservation actions are nature-based solutions, and neither should they be, because there is a need to protect and safeguard species and key areas for their own right and for their own inherent values. The second actually presents an interesting perspective on the attributes of biodiversity that we need to conserve. Conventionally and understandably, we have focused on biodiversity rarity and risk. But with nature-based solutions, we now are required to promote and have a focus on biodiversity abundance. And a good example of this is the importance of abundance of soil biodiversity to agroecology and regenerative agriculture as, let's say, a nature-based solution to food security. So that said, we still need to acknowledge that this common foundation but distinct approach may sit uneasily with some conservationists who worry that it might pose a threat to eclipsing the importance of species and habitat protection for their own inherent values. I think the other thing that to highlight here is that we aren't starting from scratch. That there is actually there's a range of tools and approaches that illustrate that nature-based solutions is scalable. And perhaps one of the first examples of this, and Natalie's already mentioned this, as a purpose-designed nature-based solution, dates back to the late 1990s and early 2000s with forest landscape restoration. Indeed, I want to highlight here that several of the recent critiques of forest landscape restoration and the Bond Challenge illustrate the importance of precision in our understanding. Because FLR is a vehicle that enhances ecosystem functionality across a range of land uses for a range of societal benefits. It is not primarily a vehicle to drive ecological restoration, and of course it can do that, but neither is it a front or a framework for the promotion of the worst of monoculture commercial plantations. And having assessed just over half the current area committed to the Bond Challenge, we know that the dominant intervention types are silviculture, in other words, enhancing degraded forests, protecting them against fire, etc., natural regeneration, and agroforestry. Woodlots and plantations, from the best of the information we've got, constitutes perhaps only 2% of the interventions. I think that's one thing of the importance of being clear on the precision of what nature-based solutions are, but then also comes to what is actually nature-based solutions delivered. And there we can actually be quite confident in saying that we have seen a series of tangible changes, including perhaps up to 1/3 of a million new jobs being created, as well as a substantive area of action on the ground. Now, I do believe that in many ways we have met the 2017 Nature editorial challenge that was put to us and our community, and we have progressed our definitional understanding of nature-based solutions, although there probably is still a little bit of work that we need to do on some of the implications. We also appear to have a strong basis of agreement on how nature-based solutions should be approached, and particularly particularly I would say with respect to climate change, based on the 4 overarching principles that Natalie profiled yesterday. These are key aspects of how we should be engaging with nature-based solutions in problem solving. The challenge now is to meet the growing demand from a whole range of stakeholders who want to know how nature-based solutions can be done, how it can be delivered on the ground. And I would emphasize that a lot of this demand comes from stakeholders who have not traditionally engaged in conservation, who don't wake up in the morning thinking about biodiversity. We also understand that from some of the substantive early experience, such as FLR, ecosystem-based adaptation, eco-disaster risk reduction, that we have a good idea of where some of the more common challenges lie in implementing nature-based solutions. And 3 come out quite clearly and are highlighted in the paper that Emmanuel Cohen-Sham and other colleagues from IUCN produced last year. Those are a failure to develop synergies with other established approaches, for example, from water engineering to crop insurance, the issue of scale and how we deal with it. And often we're still limited to projectized approaches, which is interestingly goes back to a key criticism of ICDPs 20 years ago. And finally, by extension, a failure to make linkages and address contradictions between policies, and most notably different and competing land use policies. So that brings us then to the IUCN standard. And really the rationale for that was to build on this experience and to really try and address this how-to question and avoid running up against the same set of obstacles that have led us, that have presented challenges to NbS implementation in the past. And so that led us to initiate a process over a 2-year period to come up with a practical operational framework. It draws on expert input from over 800 collaborators and follows ICL best practice, setting NbS standard that aims to facilitate good design and ongoing learning and course correction. Consists of 8 criteria, and those very quickly, those criteria include clarity on the purpose and identifying how interventions would be addressed, and the clarity on addressing specific societal challenges, an approach that adequately builds in and manages for spatial considerations. Number 3 is demonstration of biodiversity net gain. The 4th is that the approach is economically feasible. The 5th criterion, that it is inclusive and rooted in rights-based framing. The 6th, that it is that inherent trade-offs in nature-based solutions are acknowledged, worked through, and balanced in a transparent and inclusive way. The 7th is that it's implemented within an adaptive management framework. And finally, that consideration, the 8th criterion, the consideration is given to policy mainstreaming and recognizing and working with policy conflicts so that there is a longer term view on sustainability. I'm not going to go through these, and this is just to give you a little bit of a taster of how this works, because as I said, the criteria, the standard is a facilitative standard. It is, there are 8 criteria and 28 indicators, and the standard provides guidance on the rationale for each indicator, why it's important, and then how it can be approached, and gives indicator by indicator guidance on whether the practitioner's intervention qualifies as strong, adequate, partial, or insufficient. This one is for dealing with one of the indicators for biodiversity net gain, and this one of the indicators for inclusive governance. As I said, it is a facilitative standard. It is to help practitioners understand and adapt and improve and identify where key areas need to be addressed to improve the quality of nature-based solutions. But it does also actually establish a broader framework of whether an intervention or not is inside and broadly coherent, consistent with the nature-based solutions approach. So if a set of criteria, a set of indicators around one criterion all come up as insufficient, then that is a signal, as we have in this example here, that nature-based solutions are not going to be that the intervention is not yet qualifying as a nature-based solution. We put in place a robust governance framework. It'll have a scientific committee to ensure that there is a robust robust science. There will be an international committee that adjudicates and oversights and conducts the revision. And there will be a users group. And I'd really encourage anybody who wants to apply the standard to please join the user group. And in addition to that, we will actually have national hubs to support work down at the national level. I'm just going to conclude by saying that one of the things we really feel that having that sort of coherency and clarity of what is nature-based solutions has actually helped us open some additional doors. And one that we're very excited about is really starting to leverage some innovative finance, because it gives a degree of certainty of how nature-based solutions can be approached. My very final concluding statement is to say that while there is a lot of focus on nature-based solutions for climate change, I would like to echo what Cecile said yesterday, that we must always make sure that we don't become too carbon-centric. And I think particularly once we get past dealing with the exigencies of this COVID-19 health crisis and we look at the longer-term implications, we will need a range of nature-based solutions to be dealing with issues around food security, economic and social development, job creation, etc. Finally, I'd just like to invite everyone to join us at the global launch on the 23rd. There's 2 high-level sessions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and you're all most welcome. So without much further ado, I would like to hand across to Andy Norton, who's going to lead us through and moderate session number 3. And as you all know, Andy is the director of the IIED program, and will be taking us through this next session. So over to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for that great scene-setting introduction to this session. As Stuart said, I'm Andy Norton. I'm the director of IIED. By background, I'm an applied anthropologist, but with a long background and passion for, if you like, working on the social dimensions of climate change on compelling issues such as this. So this session is nature-based solutions by, with, and for people. Welcome. And a few words just to introduce before I introduce our excellent panel. The nature-based solutions framing is all about people and the human connection to the natural world. It's also all about power, politics, rights, and livelihoods. And we'll be digging into those issues during the session. We'll be discussing how Indigenous people and local communities can drive transformative nature-based solutions through a range of examples, and discussing why and how local knowledge and engagement, leadership and collective action are central to NbS for climate change. Power relations, as I mentioned at the top, are critical to this. Without a bottom-up dynamic, nature-based solutions won't work. And the structures that enable community level rights and agency to happen also need to be in place. And the politics of that, frankly, can be challenging. I'm sure we'll see lots of good ethnographic examples about that in the session. So the 2 key questions that we asked our presenters to address, firstly, were how can Indigenous peoples and local communities be empowered to engage with other stakeholders and drive the delivery of nature-based solutions? And secondly, what structures enable such agency to emerge? And later in the session, we'll be getting onto the issues of the big events which were due this year now postponed to next year, and what this agenda means for the actions and how we need to approach those events. So now let me introduce the panel. Our first speaker will be Patricia Pino, who's a researcher at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Sao Paulo, and also lead author on IPCC, the Next Assessment Report, AR6. The second speaker will be Hasib Ifanullah of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Delighted that's a very close partnership that we at IIED have with ICAD. The third speaker will be Linshu Yang of the United Nations Environment Programme. Linshu heads the International Ecosystem Management Partnership within UNEP. And the final speaker will be Cecile Njebet of the African Women's Network for the Community Management of Forests. So with that, let me go immediately now to our first speaker, Patricia. Patricia, are you there?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Andrew, for the introduction of our session, and also Stuart for setting the scene. My intention today is just to bring one more layer of complexity, how we envision nature-based solutions in the context of Indigenous people and traditional communities. And the perspective that I will bring is reflections from the Amazon basin. But so can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so when you dig into the literature, we can see that there are three major points of what nature-based solutions narratives are. So the first one is that it supports the people's need to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and inspired by, supported by, and copied by nature. So I wanted to go over this point. The second point is that nature-based solutions should or can be transformative pathways. So nonetheless, it's highly urban and highly centered in the northern hemisphere. The third point that I want to bring is that nature-based solutions should consider social environmental justice and social cohesion, as we have been seeing on the previous presentation, the governance approach that really helps people to engage to different stakeholders. So next slide, please. So how about the Indigenous territories? They have been supporting, was supposed to have a photo on this, but I don't know. But the Indigenous territories are supporting mitigation and adaptation to climate change and hazards across longer time scale and spatial scale as well. In fact, Indigenous territory has the highest level of forest cover protection, biodiverse ecosystem service, and again, across multiple spatial and temporal scales. And they have impeded the deforestation, acts as a buffer against fire incidents and associated greenhouse emissions. And then Indigenous people and land and other category has been stored the most large amount of carbon in the whole forest, around 60%. Next slide. So the second point is that nature-based solutions needs to be transformative. So how about when you face such a challenging issue of audit political economy driven by market-oriented commodities? So you have complex of drivers, chains, and path dependency across agriculture, cattle, mining, forest, and urbanization. And it's highly informal. So you cannot really see the actors who are operating this chains. Indigenous and traditional people sphere has been driven by anti-Indigenous groups at the large scale ministry. Land grabbing and use disputes is highest at the moment with several violence, neglected rights of property, health, security, and sewage, precarious urban living systems, and highly migratory fluxes of migrants across the border, especially related to climate drivers and political issues. So then the most important issue that needs to address to be transformative is that people live, indigenous people, especially in constant fear of losing land, crops, livelihoods, life, include future generations. Next slide. So then we needed to address NbS to be effective in the context of inequalities, how we appropriate nature, and then the multiple scales of political, economic, and climate threats. The third point is that indigenous, continue on that, indigenous people and local communities, although they are actually, you know, delivering climate service across multiple scales, they have the worst actual and future living standards. So life in the Amazon has never been so threatened. Only last year, 30% of forest fires were observed in 148 indigenous territories. This is new. So the Pope actually, they have the synod in the Amazon last year to talk about that and restoration of the Amazon reforest. And then it again has been portrayed, and then the climate, the issue of forest savers by models and fashion magazines. So the next slide brings me to the third point, which is consider social environmental justice and social cohesion. And on that, the whole like dynamic nature of agency, how you can, actors can lose agency associated with governance strategies across multiple scales. So we have a protagonist role of indigenous people since 1992 with Rio 20 UN Summit, and then all different instruments that the Green Agenda was looking at indigenous people and partnering with them. And then now we have a change on the whole dynamic. We have a government that is anti-indigenous, anti-social, environmental, and climatic agenda. So how we deal with this in the context of NbS and social justice. The third point out, and then this fact that I just highlight what the president of Brazil and then throughout South America is saying about indigenous people is that they needed to be developed. They don't need to have all those lands where they cannot produce anything. So what is the narrative behind this? So the next slide, and my last point is that we needed to be thinking about the narrative and the scales that matters to address social climate justice in the context of nature-based solutions. So we needed to change how we perceive and portray the Amazon in the science policy debate. It's only a representation as a global provider of commodities, including climate stability, biodiversity, and ecosystem service. But we barely account for human life, meaningful sites, communal sites, production sites, intrinsic base, identity, and agency. So what I want to say is that marginalization and exclusion, both in science and policy domain, act as an impediment for people's, indigenous people, local communities, agency and autonomy. And the threats and risks have a compounding effect, either like through the climate change, slow onset, and environmental change that leads also and act as impediment for people's agency and autonomy. So I end my talk, and I hope I have been made it through the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was fascinating. I loved the examples of social and environmental justice and the link to social cohesion, and also the illustration of indigenous peoples as activists and actors on a global scale, and the importance of changing narratives. Really fantastic points. We'll come back to those in the discussion.
Yeah, glad to answer any question. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. We'll take the questions all at okay, so now let's move to Hasib Ifanola from ICAD in Dhaka. Thank you, Hasib.
Thank you, Andrew. From Amazon, let us have a tour in the South Asia, Bangladesh. I will be telling you a story of a wetland. Next one, please. This wetland is a Ramsar site, freshwater Ramsar site, and it is called Tangwar Haur, which is blessed with both faunal and floral biodiversity. Next one, please. But the past is quite gloomy. Since 1930s, this wetland was captured by the local elites. Actually, they were overexploiting the resources, especially the fisheries ones, through the leasing system. And the people who were living around this magnificent wetland were totally excluded. That fisheries exploitation through leasing system ended in 2003 when government stopped it and focused more on conservation. Next one, please. 2006 has been a very significant year for this wetland. In that year, the government of Bangladesh started a 10-year-long project with Swiss government funding, bringing together the people and other stakeholders to sustainably manage these wetland called Tangor Haur. IUCN was leading the technical as well as field implementation along with other national and international agencies. Next one, please. Over this 10 years period, there have been some major changes. The most significant one was the inclusive governance system that was put in place and allowed the local community to access to the resources, not only fisheries, but the other natural resources. Livelihood of their livelihood improved. The resources, those were protected, actually enhanced, and that enhanced the biodiversity as a whole. Women empowerment was quite significant. All actually was possible because certain legal and political policy instruments were developed, approved, and used during this period. Next one, please. But there were some challenges, despite the fact that the whole ecosystem was managed with the people for 10 years. Livelihood opportunities still remained a bit limited. Capacity of the civil community-based organizations were not up to the mark. Confidence of the people believing in themselves that they could be able to continue the interventions and the achievement beyond the project tenure. There were certain group of people in the society, in the locality, who were actually not quite supportive to this co-management intervention. And there was a need that was felt that additional policy instruments were needed. Next one, please. So at the end of realizing those facts, at the end of this 10-year project, the government of Bangladesh actually started putting its own resources for a couple of years. They are calling it bridging phase, but that phase actually ended in 2018, which basically tried to maintain the governance structure, participatory inclusive governance structure, as well as protecting the resources. But the ultimate goal of that particular 2-year-long phase was to prepare a much bigger, much larger project that will sustain the investment that was made in 12 years' time. But that didn't happen. For the first time since 2006, the communities are on their own for the last 1.5 years. But it is quite encouraging to see that the community leadership remain vibrant. And the administrative and political system there remains supportive. That's why the management actually could sustain, the benefit sharing could sustain, and the resources of protection, the protection of resources could sustain to a certain level. Next one, please. Now, since in this particular session, we would be trying to answer these two questions, that how empowerment actually works. Let me try to answer that based upon this case study from Tangor Haur, a Ramsar site. Next one, please. To have empowered community which could deliver effective nature-based solution, we have to start from the individuals and households. We need to create their awareness in terms of realization that their involvement matters. Given the past very gloomy history, people also need to believe in the system and believe that change is possible. Capacity development as well as knowledge enhancement is also quite important. So is skills. Skills to lead, to manage, to negotiate. But these soft skills are not enough. Next one, please. We also need incentives in place, both for the community as a whole, as well as the individuals. For the community, access to resources and proper benefit sharing is very vital to keep them engaged. At individual household levels, livelihoods opportunity, market linkages, savings schemes, and access to loans is very crucial for this poverty-ridden society. Next one, please. But the community has to interact with the stakeholders, service providers, administration, and other elements in the society. That's why it is important to have a space so that they can actually interact. Governance structure is needed, not only at the ecosystem level, but also down to the village level, which is the basic unit of this landscape. Next one, please. Now, if everything can come together, we can have empowered community, active and leading. Next one, please. But they may remain project dependent. They may not sustain beyond a project tenure. That's why we need certain changes in the system. Policy and legal regime needs to be changed. And that can actually bring all the elements, all the actors together, as well as bind them together. In that situation, in that condition, empowered community can deliver effective nature-based solutions. Next one, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Hasib. I'm sure there are many points to come back to in the questions. In the interest of time, we'll move through quickly now. So the next speaker is Lin Shu.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'm not going to show my video for the interest of a connection, so I just want to say hi. And I thank Natalie and the Oxford for the invitation. And although I am a UNEP staff, but what I'm going to talk about is about sharing a story about China, because the center that I'm chairing is based in China, and actually we're collaborating with the Chinese Academy of Sciences and among other kind of institutions within China and broader there. So what I'm going to tell you is that what China did as a formal institution, but at the same time, also showing something how they're engaged with the local communities and local government. Next, please. And I know from this year onwards, China really launched several ambitious national restoration programs. So the major one is really the master plan for major national projects on protection and restoration, and of course the restoration of important ecosystems, and which sets up a significant objective for ecosystem conservation restoration in more than the decades to come. But all those are based on the previous programs that China had implemented and had gained experiences and lessons learned, and that really paved the foundation of those ambitious programs. Next, please. Next, yeah. The case of, no, sorry, the previous one. The case of, what I want to share with you, this case of Chinese Ecosystem Research Network. And this network had been more than 3 decades long, and it was established by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. But what they provide is, they provide monitoring, research, demonstration, and policy support. Of course, by looking at this, you know, this is a top-down design, and it's a network-based. Right now, there are over more than over 2,000 scientists working on different ecosystems and across the country. For example, they have 44 field stations and 5 disciplinary centers and 1 synthesis center connected all of this. Next, please. The way they are working and approaching to the scientific standards and engaging and collaborating with not only the scientific community and NGOs and the governments are through standardize their monitoring indicators and methods and instruments. but also they are using network-based information sharing through observation experiments. But because those stations are located in all around the different parts of the country, they got support. They need to support the local government, the communities in technology development and demonstration. Vice versa, the local communities and the governments are the experimental drivers for those new technologies. Of course, they provided the policy advices to the top leadership at the national level as well. Next, please. And then when we talk about the measures of those kind of restoration, we always want to know what the gains of it. I really liked the Stuart kind of said how the frame about the NbS, but what we wanted to know whether we can bring the core benefit and contribute to all fronts. So what we are the assessment for the last 3 decades shows that the China Ecosystem Research Network has generated 46 restoration technologies and 10 models that can be upscaled, and at 72 million hectares, and generated a size of nearly 12 billion RMB as economic benefit through different kind of ecosystem, both at national level and also impact and global level impact. For example, Loess Plateau water and soil erosion practice has been upscaled at the national level, which is a Grain for Green program, and in the Geo6 they call it a Great Grain War. So that involves a lot of people, and we claim it's the largest restoration program in the world actually. At a global level, global dryland ecosystem program has reached far to African and Asian countries. Next, please. And although I said that the Chinese Ecosystem Research Network is a top-down design, but at the same time, because they engage with the local communities, in the events that the local communities need to improve their climate adaptation capacity, and they needed the support. For example, one is that a case is that the supporting the local communities to enhance farmers' seed systems and employ ecological agriculture by empowering women, because in China's 40 years of economic reform really brought up the employment changes where men migrate to the urban areas for off-farm job, and women are left in the countryside to tend the farm. So local farmers needed to change and conserve and change the setting and conserve the agrobiodiversity, and they need to protect the farmer seed systems for resilience, for adaptation. And they needed to introduce eco-circular agriculture and increasing the livelihood options. So in this case, women are taking the lead, empowering women, not only providing them with information and market channel, but at the same time, technical support is something the local people has received from the former institutions. Next, please. So coming back to the 2 questions that Andrew posed and to this session with the example, the cases I just explained. So how can indigenous people and local communities be empowered to engage with other stakeholders? I think through the stories I've shared is to provide incentives and support to all who participated. For example, the Grain for Green program, they provide the payment for ecosystem services, and that has been a driver, and that created so many green jobs, alternative jobs, but the green jobs, and giving farmers and rural local household alternative livelihoods. Of course, at the same time, they need a capacity building. For example, they need to retreat from heavy dependence on natural resources, but they need the skills to find alternative jobs. So that's what the government and the stations did. And also you need to find the right entry point. For example, the gender empowerment is what we looked at. So because local farmers are, local ladies are the driving forces in the farming sector. So they needed to be empowered, and through seed preserving for multiple benefits, including biodiversity conservation and sustainable livelihood and for adaptation. And of course, that also improves the gender equality. In terms of what structures enable such agency to emerge, what I think is that allow for multiple level initiatives to emerge at the same time. So although the story I shared about the ecosystem network is government-led and top-down design of national institutions, but they have generated a lot of knowledges that the locals can adapt and can use. So with scientists, NGOs, and others as brokers or catalysts, linking up local community and government and private sectors jointly tackle local issues, and based on the scientific knowledge that generated. For example, in our cases, when farmers collected the seeds, they built their own seed bank, but the plant breeders coming up to tell them what are the species that are, how they can store it, and what are the conditions, climate conditions they needed, or environmental threat that they're meeting. So with those, they can make this kind of collaboration and multi-stakeholder engagement to continue and meet the multiple interests, because the plant breeders also interested in the local varieties. So they're mutually benefiting each other. With that, I end my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lin Chu. That's a fascinating insight into such an important experience and the way the different levels interacted in your presentation. Really interesting. I'm sure we'll come back to that in the questions. Now, pleasure to introduce our final speaker, Cecile Ngebet. Cecile, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you all. Welcome. I will be sharing a case study of women. Because of the lack of the disappearance of the fish in their villages, they started rehabilitating the mangrove area. So I will going to talk about that, and then I will be finishing with the key messages. First of all, REFACOF is our network I work with. We are in 20 countries in Africa. Our mission is to promote women's rights in Africa and advocate to shape policies and practices for gender equality in relation to land and forest tenure. The importance of mangrove for women, this is the first thing we have to recall, is that women, as everybody in the mangrove area, mangrove are their life. Mangrove are the means of their living, their homes, their sources of food, of revenue, of medicine. They carry out their agricultural land and fishing activities in the mangrove. They use the wood for energy and for housing. They use mangrove as sacred site for traditional practices and ceremony, as well as for leisure and tourism. They collect non-timber forest products for the market, for food, and for the medicine from their mangrove area. Why is that? How have they used the nature-based solution to come over about the problems? First of all, the community is called Longi. Longi community is based along the coastal area of Cameroon. What they have started restoring degraded mangrove, because they realized that there was a lot of problem in their environment. Mangrove were disappearing very rapidly, and this is a big threat for their life and for their families and for their society. The fish production was also reducing, and some high-value fish were disappearing. The sea level was increasing, it was increasingly rising, and women fear a tsunami in the coming years if nothing was done. Floods became more important, especially after the rains. Soils were increasingly poor on their quality, and they were reduced for agricultural production. Many food products get rot before their maturity. The water was increasingly salty, so unsuitable for consumption. Children and elderly were suffering more and more from waterborne diseases, and it was becoming hotter and warmer each year than in the previous years. So what did they do? They started mapping the degraded mangrove area, and we carry out advocacy with the head of families and the head of village to recognize women's collective ownership of the map mangrove area. Then we organized training on mangrove indigenous seed collection techniques. We trained them in nursery establishment with women in the village, and then they stand planted in the natural environment. They collected the indigenous fish species, and they started enriching the indigenous, but with the indigenous method, the reforested mangrove area with the local fish species. So far today, they have succeeded to restore 46% of the mangrove that was degraded, and they have increased their fish production up to 28%, and we can see now improved income among the women. To answer the two questions, I think is very important. What can be done to empower the women, rural women and indigenous women? First of all, we think that it's very important to build their capacities. It's very important for the women to have security to the land they are working on, because the mangrove area, of course, is the government area, which cannot be owned by communities, but at least the recognition of ownership can be done so that the women who are restoring the mangrove and trying to bring back the fish for the community have the right on those spaces, on those areas. That was first. The second one is also, I talk about community capacity building and tenure security. The third one is also livelihood option. I think it's very important because we cannot be restoring the degraded areas just for fun. We communities, women, rural and indigenous, are very keen to do that, but at least they need alternative sources of income. Of course, the fish is bringing income for them, but it's not their property. It's not exclusive property. So we need to see how to develop alternative sources of income for those women. And also it's very important, the linkages between the communities, the scientists, the government, and the private. That partnership is key to continue to promote nature-based solutions for the women, rural women and indigenous women. If the scientists can help support with scientific information on the species, on seed, on the techniques, then the loss are reduced, the losses could be reduced, and it will increase the production. So that link is very important. Also, with the privates, the mangrove is not providing only fish. Of course, women realize that the fish are disappearing. It was important to restore the mangrove. But as I told you earlier, it was not the fish only. The climate was also degrading very bad. The places were becoming hot and warm every year, warmer and warmer. People, the boys, the children were becoming sick of waterborne diseases. So I think these are things the scientists can be looking for, how to improve the livelihood by looking for solutions that will help to reduce those problems. And the state, the government should also take their responsibilities by also, first of all, enabling, putting policies and regulation that can save and secure what communities are doing. We have policies, but usually the practices at the local level can be completely different from what the policies have provided, like the room. So the government also has the responsibility to look after that and to provide enabling conditions for those nature-based solutions for what women are doing. I think this is so far what I can say from these experiences. I'm sure that if we secure the tenure of the women, the tenure right, and if we provide access to resources, access to decision making, it will help to promote a nature-based solution. And of course, the relationship, the partnership with private sector, with scientists will also improve that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cecile. Really great to have those examples and the emphasis on rights, on tenure rights, and also on the various power structures engaged and on women's roles. Really fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. Now I will go to the chat box, and the organizers have been helpfully, if you like, sifting a very large number of questions that have come in. So I will now just look for some. And the first one is for you, Patricia. So from your experience, how can nature-based solutions be transformative in the context of power differentials? You're describing a situation where it might be thought the indigenous people might be seriously on the back foot, particularly at the moment. So how can nature-based solutions be most effective in that kind of a situation?
So this is a very good question, and I think I tried to answer on the panel, but on the writing some of this answer. But I think first, like what transformative means, or what transformation, or what we intended to do by that. What I like it to use is a definition that we worked on the IPCC Special Report 1.5, where we had for the first time within the panel the IPCC a very dramatic look with the inequality and poverty lenses. So in that regard, transformative needs to be beyond just a simple, in our view, beyond a simple technological fix, or like just using like an economic instruments to place that and force people, especially indigenous people, to work with instead of all the way around. So if you take their view and their role, I think what is the most important for them is, and then you have been seeing throughout this, is like secure the land rights, secure their dignity or their way of doing things, right? And working in collaboration with them. So we have some historical success of this partnership throughout. I'm not talking about only the Brazilian Amazon, but also across borders, where truthfully engagement of indigenous communities and taking their agency and power to deal with this large schemes like RED, for instance, and now reduction emission and deforestation has had some sort of level of success up until now, where we can see that again, agency in this context is very dynamic, and now they are completely oppressed. So my question is, how can you make, it's more of a question and then really work with like IUNC to really address the social inequality and also the power asymmetries that can undermine agency. Because the way we talked about social cohesion is very loose. When you really understand the different layers that undermine people autonomy and agencies, and then we can be transformative. So very, very short, and I will be happy to talk more about it.
Thank you very much indeed, Patricia. A very good answer to a very complex question. Hasib, a couple of questions for you here now. Could you explain a little more about what you mean by inclusive governance in this context? And then another really interesting question. You said at the beginning of your presentation that before communities were involved in the management of the wetlands, the fish stocks were quite badly depleted. Since you've had this approach of community engagement, have the fisheries populations recovered? Hasib, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. The inclusive governance actually here means, as I said, till 2000, at the turn of this century, till then, it was leased out, this magnificent, huge wetland. And there was no right of the people to access it. They couldn't even bid to partake part in the leasing system. So what happened, from the land ministry, the ownership of this wetland was transferred to the Ministry of Environment and Forest. That actually changed the whole thing. When the project came into the scene in 2006, one of the major issue was how to reinstate people's right on that. And to do that, there were, they call it 3-layer governance structure. At the top, which is the central one at the ecosystem level, you know, there are, that wetland belong to quite a few administrative locations. That's why there was a kind of an administrative layer. And at the bottom, that was a village layer, so that people can actually, and the representation from bottom to up continued. And there was an additional layer, which is among the different stakeholders working in that area, like the local administration, the service provider, but also representation from the people. So as you can understand, from at the all the layers of the governance, people's representation were there. In most of the cases, 100%, and at the very top level, which is kind of supportive body, it was partially. The second is a very interesting question. Definitely, the whole wetland can be divided into small segments. In winter, it get, what do you call it? It dried out and become a kind of a smaller pockets, perennial water body. But during monsoon, it turned into a huge, almost 10,000 hectare of wetland. So the idea was, there was a difference, what do you call it? There was zonation, core area as well as buffer area. Buffer area was opened for commercial fisheries, and the data is there every year, at least since 2010 to 2016. That actually shows that the quantity of fish, the quality of fish actually increased quite a lot. And the most important thing is these fish are harvested and it is sold, and part of the benefit actually comes to the community, which is a fantastic arrangement supported by government rule. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hasib. A question now for Lin Chu. Has demonstrating the efficacy of nature-based solutions changed China's policies? And that's from Kimiko Link. Apologies to the earlier questioners that I didn't give their names. But anyway, let's just repeat that. It's a really interesting one. Has demonstrating that the NbS are working, has that changed anything in the policy framework within China?
The answer is yes, because of the success. My first slide actually is demonstrated that because of the past experience, China sets up a new ambitious target for restoration, for protection, and they're introducing other type of protected areas, like national parks or somehow. This is all based on that previous kind of experiences, even lessons learned. So yeah.
Great, thanks very much. Also, this is one I think I'd like to put to both you and Patricia. It can be for everyone, but are nature-based solutions only for liberals? How can we engage both sides of the political spectrum? Lin Chu, do you want to take that first?
I'm not sure I understand the question clearly. Could Andrew explain a little bit more of that one?
Well, I think the question is getting at that we're using a lot of languages like bottom-up empowerment and so on and so forth, but we're often working.
Okay, let me just try to say, because when you address certain environmental issues, there is a certain degree of public goods in nature.
Yeah.
With public goods, probably you need a bit of a top-down driving forces from the political will and commitment. And then at the other times, you probably think about where are the common goals between the public sector and private sector. If you demonstrated those conserved environment or protected ecosystem could benefit economically to the society, and investors would come. So I would say both. And at the same time, local people are feeling every day about this threatening degraded ecosystems. If you demonstrate from top down and demonstrate something is good, they would naturally be a partner there. So I also work, because I'm also an economist, I worked in other places where looking at the serving local communities' willingness to contribute to certain type of public goods or somehow, and the private goods, you could easily see that they're skewed towards private goods. So to me, that restoration and ecosystem protection conservation has partially public nature and private nature, depends on how we address it. So I think we would have wanted to both sides, but the political driving forces must be there. I'm not sure whether my answer addresses the question or not.
I saw Cecile smiling at that question as well. Do you want to have a go at it, Cecile?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that what Lucia has said is really correct. We need, you know, where we are living in a patriarchal society where everything is controlled by men. And if you need and people, communities, women especially, they are now being impacted very negatively by the climate change, by COVID-19, by all the type of diseases you cannot imagine. So they are the first to be very negatively impacted. They need to, the government, if they want to use the top-down approach, they need to bring in solutions and then adapt it to their living condition and the way they have been living traditionally. That's how we can ensure sustainability and the buying in of the communities. They will not agree or accept anything coming from outside just for granted, because they have been also been experiencing so many things that did not work. So we have to take advantage of the local knowledge, traditional knowledge, and built in with the scientific knowledge. Then communities can adapt to that and see how they can improve what they are living as problems or in their environment, because they are being victimized. And when you are victimized, you are ready to change because you have a sustainable solution. But it's not a sustainable, it cannot be sustainable if it's imported. It should be indigenous plus something proved by scientific, and then it can work. I agree fully with Lynch. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Cecile. Patricia, another question for you. It's related, but slightly different spin. How will nature-based solutions address the political economy drivers of forest destruction, indigenous peoples' marginalization, and the centralization of power by national elites and governments? These issues have defied many other instruments crafted to protect, manage, and restore ecosystems in the past, and many ongoing ones. So how can NbS overcome those challenges that other approaches have struggled with?
Okay, thanks. Good and tough questions. So I think like just coming back, to answer is the deliver. So we are talking about a transformative, right, approach. So in order to be transformative, we needed to put different lenses on to look at these issues, right? So, and then as someone already raised, which is Stuart talk, that NbS has been portrayed pretty much as like this green jargon, exactly because I haven't seen yet from the literature, but I think it's coming up. I'm revising some articles that are really looking with this view for like a more critical view on NbS, and then like how we can put that forward. So one huge component that we needed to stress on the transformative approach to address the drivers of change, and then also like to what extent people's autonomy or agency can be in leverage to take decisions that are on their good. So what I'm saying is that just the social climate justice lens is a good approach if you want to incorporate that on NbS, because those that are least responsible are the ones that are bearing the costs. And in this case, also from the development approach, economic development approach, are being, like, all the externalities are being bared by some people. It's not equally around the world. So I'm still to be seen, but I'm revising just one paper now that is coming in a critical view of these issues. But as we said, NbS, nature-based solution, that's why we're here discussing. It's something very unique, and then is situated in a place that can really make a change if we address correctly this issue and not just incorporate another jargon that we don't need that, right? Thank you. So now I'm sorry if I answered that.
Thanks very much indeed, Patricia. Cecile, another question for you. What livelihood alternatives has the project you described helped create for women, and how have you worked to ensure these are sustainable?
Okay, thank you so much. What we tried to push as alternative was agricultural activities. Because of this mangrove degradation, we started training women for, how do you call it, the 3 months agricultural food production, and also raising chicken. And it was all about livelihood, food. It was around the food production area. So they were doing, some were doing pepper production, because pepper has a high value in the area. It's very costly in the market at certain time of the year. And some of them went to maize production. Others, it was just a product for 3 months cultivation period, because that was the only period, the 3-month period, that could allow agricultural activities. Those who were involved in chicken production, they could do it longer. And we have some who have really gone very far with the chicken production, and it's been done till today. The sustainability is very key in that process, because sometimes you saw some who have done the 3 months production, they have got some good production, they have generate some income, but sometimes they just leave it out. So you need to continue to support them and continue to help them in those activities. But I think what is key for those communities is really what we were talking about. And I saw it with RED Plus process. Because when the regulation is clear that we need to involve local communities, women and men, rural women and indigenous women in the process, you see that we have good chance to go for that. We have, for example, in Cameroon, in Cote d'Ivoire, in some other countries, we have supported the RED Plus processes, and we ended up with 30%, 35%, sometimes even 40% of women, rural women, local women and indigenous women being part of decision-making at the local level, subnational level, and national level. And unless they are part of that, unless they participate to how can I say it, to the planning, to the analysis of their environment, and to search for solutions for their environment, unless they are part of all that process, it will be difficult to ensure the sustainability. So nature-based solution is really an approach that could promote sustainability, that could promote women's rights, security, that could promote livelihood development. And we need local community at the center if we really want to achieve all that. If we want to address climate change, we need nature-based solution, because we have local indigenous way of doing things that can help to improve the situation. Thank you. I hope I made it.
Hello, Andy, are you with us? I think his internet connection has failed. So we'll crack on with the questions. Hopefully Andy will be able to join us very soon. I think he's just disconnected and we'll reconnect again. Looking at some questions here that have come in we've had lots of questions coming in during this session, so that's excellent. And there'll be an opportunity for you to follow up on some of the questions that we don't have time to address. And we will share that with all our attendees at the end. So question here, how do we truly ensure that the nature-based solutions agenda matches local communities' interests and motives, as nature isn't always beneficial to local people, or at least it's not perceived as being such, and that changes, of course, over time. So who would like to, maybe Hasib?
I can take it. I find it a bit interesting that nature is not always beneficial. How do we define nature? If we are saying that elephants are destroying our habitat, our crop, the question is where are we actually staying? Why and where actually wildlife, their range and our settlement actually overlaps. If we believe that nature is important for us, ecosystem services, if we use that term, is important for us, definitely we need to maintain its quality, quantity for the benefit of ourselves. And local community, often they are very much involved and very much depend upon natural resources, the water, the fish, the timber. So I'm not sure that why nature shouldn't be beneficial. But in other ways, if we focus on local people's, local communities' interest, which is very important. And that's why we need to remember that when we are talking about nature-based solution, this session is all about people, isn't it? We shouldn't exclude them. And we have been actually discussing that in this open discussion, answering that question. So we need to realize local people's interest, their aspiration. And we also, I should emphasize, we should also remember the cultural values, cultural issues. You can't say that a particular nature-based solution is like a one-size-fits-for-all. So we need to appreciate that, and that's how we can actually modify or design our nature-based solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a question here for Ling Zhu, actually, and it's about how we have to change our vocabularies often depending on the audiences that we're talking to and the frameworks. And there's just a lot of technical languages associated with different disciplines within science and, of course, across different sectors as well. And everybody's increasingly talking about the need for these communities of practice that bring together these different types of stakeholders. And so how have you managed in China to connect the scientists with the NGOs, with the policymakers and the local communities when they're all using slightly different languages? And I think this is a really important question in general in the world of nature-based solutions, where the whole point is to bring together diverse forms of knowledge. But often it's just really hard to do because we just don't understand what we're all talking about, right? So it'd be great to hear. And the others perhaps could answer this question.
It's a very tough question and an interesting question. I always find it's fascinating when we are questioning ourselves or the language we talk about. But I think I would not answer saying we pick up a language to popularize in different communities, but the issues are commonly understandable. For example, the government wants everybody to get rich and get out of poverty, right? So that's a government goal. But the policymakers want to understand the mechanisms, what are causing the people to stay in poor and not being rich or somehow. And the local communities, probably the struggle, how can I earn more money? So those are the different languages been tackling the same thing, right? Poverty alleviation, I think everybody understand I want to get rich and I want to not to be poor. So with this kind of a common goal, because government wanted to show their political performance, good performance and gain recognition by community, but they also have the responsibility and making sure everybody and nobody's left behind when there's economic development there. So with this kind of things, if we're talking about using this kind of understanding to talk to people it's easy. So about NGOs and private sectors, sometimes they have a social responsibility. And sometimes they have the goodwill and they have resources, but they don't know where to put. So we as a community, like a development, okay, we are development specialists where we know what the local people's needs and we know what the interests of NGOs or somehow, so we can bridge this kind of dialogue. That's why I said we can act as a catalyst or bridge, like bridging the information gap there. So it's not always the case because you need patience. There's a challenges where you build the trust, it takes a long time. Sometimes we can easily lost interests. So I don't have a perfect answer to all the things, but I can say, depends on how you pick up a common interest that serves all the purposes. And then we don't worry about the vocabularies because we're on the same, kind of platform where we wanted to work together. But that it's easy to say, but the process takes a lot of efforts. There must be some people who act as a catalyst to resent of some of their own interests and to start, talking to different kind of stakeholders and bring them on the same table. For example, when we talk about local people say, hey, you need to conserve your varieties because it's so interesting. It is so important for agrobiodiversity conservation. No, we don't want to because the commercial varieties are much higher yield, so we want to go for that. So how you bring these kind of things? And then we brought the plant, because I'm an economist, so we have a sociologist working with, but I brought the plant breeders coming in. They start talking about, hey, if you conserve this, in the future, you could contribute to so X and Y, Z, and then to the society. And then the farmer said, what do I get? And then scientists start working on the benefit, access benefit sharing, where we need to reward those people who conserve those agrobiodiversity. But to build a mechanism is not the community people talking to them. You need to engage with the government because they are the ones who control the financial resources, location of the financial budget. But we also need to bring into private sector because they might be the one who initially could fund those kind of efforts of conservation. So it's a multiple dimensional communication and dialogue to get this common understanding. I don't know. I think it didn't have a structure, but I just want to describe what we've been engaging. So.
No, that's really interesting here. It's really just fascinating to hear about different perspectives from very different parts of the world. Actually, I don't know whether any of the other panelists wanted to ask that question about how you get over the different languages, or would you like to move on to another question? Are you any of you keen to answer that, or shall I move on? Yes, Ceci, but go on then. Thank you.
Very quickly, nature-based solution is being talked about in Bangladesh quite recently. And what we have been trying to do from ICAD with University of Oxford, we are trying to put forward that it is not a new concept. It is maybe the framing is new, but we have been doing it for years after years. That actually help all the stakeholders, government, policymakers, researchers, to come together. Well, yes, conserving forest, involving people makes sense. Ecosystem-based adaptation. Yes, I'm familiar with ecosystem-based adaptation. Oh, that is also nature-based solution. So how you frame it, how you build on the achievement a country has achieved, and add and bring everybody together to go forward, that actually work. And we believe it is in Bangladesh still now, it is working, and people are gaining interest in nature-based solution, the framing, the concept. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So land tenure is obviously, organized in so many different ways in so many parts of the world. And even within regions, you have this variation in how that plays out. And of course, it's critically important. And you mentioned it, all of it mentioned it as being a key condition. Often land tenure can cause massive implementation challenges, right? And could you perhaps describe, Cecile, I can ask you this question, describe how clear land tenure can enable nature-based solutions can be successfully achieved, what that looks like from your perspective, and our power relation shifting towards women's and Indigenous access and ownership to land and resources. And then after Cecile, Patricia, if I may, it would be great to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. It's very right. It's very right. If we need sustainability for nature-based solution, we need tenure security. And I was saying it also earlier, how to address that, how to make sure things will go as we plan with tenure security. We are in the patriarchal model where in my context, in Africa in general, women do not own land, they don't have property right to land. So what we're trying to do, and what I think could be done at scale, is working with the family chief, usually is a man, working with the village chief, usually is a man, working with elected people like a councillor at the local level, and also member of the parliament at the national level. We try that in Cameroon. We work with a village chief, we work with a family chief. We even had a program with queen mothers, the wife of the village chief. And we saw that they need to understand where the problem lies. Usually, this is culture. All what is being done so far is culturally built in the culture of the people. You are a girl. When you are born in a family, you are supposed to go and get married to another family. So you don't have any right from your own native family because you are a girl. We started showing the consequences, the negative impact of that to village chief and to the head of families. And they realized that you have your kids, they should have the same rights. They should deserve inheritance because they are born there. Now, when you are a girl and you go to marriage, in your husband family, you also depend on your husband line. You don't have any property line where you have gone to marriage. And if you don't have a male kid, if your husband passes away, you will lose everything there because the family will take over everything and they will show you that you are coming from somewhere else. Finally, where is the place of the women? I put the women usually like a bird. You are just flying from this side to the other, and you don't have the feet on the earth, on the ground. So we started working with village chief and head of families to let them understand the negative impact of that culture. It's not that our culture is bad, but some element of the culture are bad because they even prevent them from improving their livelihood. When you show that in a series of, as Patricia said it, Hassett said it, and Lucia said it, is a long-term process. We need to come again and again and again because we cannot change culture in one day. The culture has been there for years, for centuries. People are born into that. But with time, with awareness raising, with sensitization, with a concrete program, because you have a project and you cannot succeed with restoration if you don't have security to the tenure. And it's not only for the women. Of course, the women's situation is worse, but even for men. You in Cameroon, for example, what is the legislation? Trees have their legislation, forests have their legislation, land has their legislation. So the legislation is so different, and it's only from 19th that they started involving communities in the forestry management. So we need to also work with the politicians, and we set up a program, an advocacy program with the member of parliament to tell them this is the problem. If you want to succeed with nature-based solution, we need to secure the tenure issues. Unless we secure the tenure issues, we cannot. It will be difficult. So we work at that 3 or 4 layers. The family chief, because if the land, the space or the area belong to a family chief, is usually a man, you have to work with him to show him that it's very important, because see what your wife is doing, see what your girl can be done. You show the interest, you show the impact, the positive impact of the role the women are playing, and they are likely open, more likely to be open to that change. We did it at that level, and then we moved to the next level with the village chief, because in our communities, we have the village chief that control the entire village. You start with the family, and then we went to the village chief, and we saw, and we know the women role and influence or impact, or even, power with his or her husband. We try also to work with women that are married to the chiefs to show them where we can, if we do this, this is the result, the positive result. If we do that, this is the negative result. And then we move to the parliamentarian for them to try to push for the legislation to be changed. That's how as Lucia was saying, we don't have a magic, solution, but I think with time, with sensitization, awareness raising, and showing by facts the impact. If it's positive impact, you show why it's positive impact. If it's negative impact, you also show why it's negative impact. We are more likely to succeed. But nature-based solutions need security to land. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But Patricia, just would you like to address that? We're actually right at the end, but I would love to hear about your perspective from the from Amazonia, and we'll come to the end of the session after that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will be very brief, because I think Cecilia and most of Hassab and Linux have touch upon this issue, but I think the whole issue of land tenure and rights, it's especially in the context, I'm saying this on the context of the indigenous people here in Brazil, which, as we said, has a particular history of marginalization and being this legacy of just an instrumental role that they have. But in fact, when they really have their own needs, we are really not willing to listen or willing to support. So I mean, in that regard, security, we have shown throughout history here, as I show on the timeline, how much indigenous lands are the ones, the territories that has the most protected area, has most favoring conservation approach, as really promoting climate service. But then using the economic, this goes a little bit different from Linux view of the economic bargain, which I think is driving the most of the issues in the Brazilian Amazon. The history that we know throughout Brazil is that only cattle ranching, only commodities, only mining can bring money and prosperity to people. So until we are not willing to understand that nature-based solutions as a transformative pathways needed to give voice to different outcomes, which cannot only be measured in economic terms, right? So, and as health, we cannot sometimes put a tag price on the bale until you lose it. It's the same thing with nature. So I think we needed to be attentive to the land tenure rights and within the history of the country, but then also make sure that a nature-based solutions doesn't really replicate this coercive and an equal collaboration with Indigenous people. So I think that's key. We don't want to, like, I think just like placing Indigenous people and wild nature is already a fake dichotomy that we still perpetuating. So to what extent we can bring this together and really leverage on the NbS, I think it can be a very, very powerful and transformative tool. Yeah, so I don't want to go over, but I think it's pretty much on the line of whose autonomy we are giving, whose agency we're talking about, who are the people who are benefiting from this nature that we are talking about. If we do that reflection, I think we can be really able to answer in a less homogeneous way to this world of different people, different lifestyle, different cultures. And then I think that can be a transformative to address those issues, as we can see throughout mostly in the developing world, right? So we are having a different trajectory, and then I think the international domain should help us to leapfrog to a different stage. And then I think NbS could do that if we really have a critical lens and really invert and get away of this dichotomies or coercive and unequal power relations and collaboration.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful way to end. I agree. I think we're all in agreement of the need to bring people and nature together. People are part of nature, and that's the point. And everything else will work out if we keep that very, very much in our mind. So thank you all. This has been a really, really, I found a very energizing, really compelling session. I think you've all given us an enormous amount, a lot of food for thought to take away with us into our worlds. And I really look forward to following your work and to working with you in future. And yeah, so thanks very, very much for your time and engagement with this. I want to thank as well Andy Norton for wonderful moderation of this session. We're very sorry that we lost him part the way through. And thanks also to a great audience. We had a large audience, lots of great questions. We addressed some of them. Many have not been answered. So we, as I said earlier, we will make sure that you see those questions and you have an opportunity to answer them, and then we will share them with this community as part of our follow-up materials. So thank you very much. And we look forward to welcoming everybody back at 3:30 British Summer Time for the next panel, which is on nature-based solutions and biodiversity. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.